How do we create healthy and constructive and enjoyable conditions of discourse in an increasingly polarized and ideologically volatile world? Have you been in any conversations recently where the very mention of a certain word or phrase or current event causes such immediate divisiveness that it becomes impossible to even communicate, impossible to understand the other person or be understood by them? Do you sometimes feel personally triggered by a given topic or a given idea, or feel that there are certain topics that you can't even articulate without in turn triggering others simply by bringing them up? What would it be like to converse in a way where it's safe and fruitful to truly question one another's assumptions and our own without making one another feel destabilized and attacked? Questions like this are especially pertinent to our virtual spaces, where the way that we display ourselves and put ourselves forward is mediated by our screens. And we do have a genuine interaction with one another, but that interaction is diffused throughout the general informational intensity of the digital age. I can choose to be anyone here in this moment. I can choose to present whatever side of myself I want to be, though I often find myself choosing to be the side of myself that is psychologically reinforced or economically rewarded by the algorithms and discourse conditions that partially determine my behavior, my identity, my philosophy, and my political affiliation. I can choose to be any side of myself, but I pick the one that's safe and that gets me comments and likes, or that makes me feel included in the group. But the way we treat one another in our virtual spaces does end up affecting the way we treat one another in the so-called real world. Though in the first place, all of it, even the internet, is real. All of it is human interaction. All of it involves the encounter with the other in the present moment, where we meet one another and change one another in the act of meeting. But these virtual spaces have the capability of providing a unique venue for transformative exchange, because they're spaces where, by creating a totally new and in some ways neutral context, plucked out of the immediate materiality that conditions us as finite physical beings, we can meet one another in this dialectical dance of being separate and yet together, like quantum particles interacting at a distance. They can be third spaces, a term coined by the sociologist Ray Oldenburg, places of meeting that are neither home nor work, but a third thing, a space of free and non-obligational conversation and community. Nevertheless, many of the virtual spaces that I move in have felt increasingly less amenable to this ideal. Social media becomes an echo chamber where one's own opinions and fears are reinforced and commodified. There are places that are only safe and beneficial to be insofar as you're there to reinforce the identity structure that's become acceptable for your brand, your audience, your ideologically congealed, algorithmically agglomerated virtual identity pocket. And this very feature of online discourse sometimes spills over into the meat space life world. I feel the performative constrictions of identity, ideology, and politics ever more acutely in my in-person conversations, and this seems to get worse the longer we move through the internet age. Addressing this is one of the goals behind the alternative online space that I've been working on, an online learning community called Grokist. I know that sounds like an advertisement. It's not an advertisement, it's just something I'm actually doing. One of the goals for this space is to offer precisely this kind of third space open exchange, a place about which one could truly say you don't have to have any specific beliefs to be here, which is how one of its members recently described it. The idea is to cultivate true diversity of perspective, since the community is rooted not in a common dogma, but a common mode of being, a mode that we sometimes summarize with the words curiosity and care. These are fundamental modes because both beyond and before identity, my sense of who I am, and ideology, my sense of what I believe, the most important thing is the immediate encounter between oneself and the other, the fundamental relational moment, this mystery right here of us interacting even asynchronously, that is the source of all experience and all ethics. And so the rules of the space are not reducible to a list of do's and don'ts. Rather, those rules emerge as tendencies or patterns, the organic outgrowth of a generalized culture of care. Some call this the ethics of care. That's a term coined by the ethicist and psychologist Carol Gilligan. Ethics is not about some great big right or wrong scrawled in the sky. It's always situational. It's always situated in the actual context of what's going on, and therefore it's always conversational between two sentient entities. And the mutual responsibility that we have to one another simply by being in conversation, even if it's a conversation that's asynchronous, like the moment of you watching this video, is ultimately a matter of recognizing the other as an end in themselves, a living person rather than a mere avatar for a certain belief or ideological block. Okay, so that's a bunch of words. What does this mean in a more tangible sense in an actual conversation involving an actual controversial issue? Take, for instance, the topic of veganism or vegetarianism. This is something that's perennially controversial, but that oftentimes people do a good job navigating. This is something that comes up often in our course about the philosophy of ecology. Consider the slogan, "Meat is murder." As a vegetarian, I might hold that statement to be true in an important way. My conviction of its truth may in fact be the foundation of my vegetarianism as a practice. Can I hold that conviction and even voice it and still at the same time be in dialogue with someone who is eating a burger in the very moment of our conversation? Yes. Is that in some way contradictory? Yes. But the contradictory nature of that moment is secondary to the mutual care implicit in our interaction. In other words, in order to get into the philosophical weeds of whether or not it's right to eat meat, we have to sincerely be able to raise the question about whether or why it's wrong without accusing one another in doing so. And when we converse, we make an absolute minimum of assumptions about the underpinnings of those assertions. If we can't strike that tonal balance and perform that self-examination, then the conversation is lost. Emotional vibration is truly more important than conceptual agreement because shared vibration is experientially prior to shared opinion. But if all of that emotional mumbo-jumbo seems too wishy-washy and vague, we can also look at the matter more analytically. We can say that if we disagree, we can analyze whether our disagreement is occurring on the level of interpretation, or of policy, or of value. And based on this, we can find coherence even if we don't find agreement. We may discover that we share the same values, but have different interpretations as to what those values mean in a given situation. We may agree on the value statement, we shouldn't be cruel to animals, but in your interpretation that may include the possibility of non-cruel slaughtering, whereas I might consider all slaughtering to be inherently cruel. Or we may agree on our values and our interpretation of them, but have different views about what action or policy should proceed from that. We may both wish for a cruelty-free and butchery-free world, but one of us may feel that other concerns, such as nutrition under the present availability of food resources, take precedence over that ideal at the present time. Then again, we may ultimately have true disagreements of value, where we don't agree on fundamental matters of judgment. I think X about the nature of reality, you think Y, and these opinions are inherently contradictory. However, if we can see that disagreement and talk about it, we can at least understand one another, and the channel of discourse remains open, which provides the substratum for possible reconciliation and obtainment of better flows of energy exchange and enjoyment of life for each of us in whatever context. In this attitude of exploratory tentativeness, one is less likely to revert to stock political slogans of declarative, performative certainty, slogans like "meat is murder," even if you sympathize with the cause that that slogan promotes. Because in the end, provocative propaganda, even when it's for a cause you truly think is right, is still just that, provocative propaganda. And the greater cause beyond it, that of general well-being, may ultimately be better served by being attentive to how you say the truths you say, and how reconciliatory they are, and acknowledging the contingent nature of your own truths, even the ones that seem most natural. The truly political space is not one that is characterized by belonging to one or another political party, but rather by being a space that we can both enter sharing only two assumptions: the assumption that we both want to be here, and that we fundamentally care for one another in a way that transcends our differences. Those hip to political philosophy will recognize that this is exactly the ideal that liberal democracy is supposed to offer: the opportunity for all of us to get along, even if we completely disagree, united by the common desire to be able to disagree and still get along. Unfortunately, liberal democracy has managed to screw this up on a dazzling scale. Perhaps because it's often failed to open that space to everyone equally, and because it's built its whole economic edifice on the destruction of those it leaves outside its circle of care. But that's another story. The truly political, if we go back before the modern connotations of that word, is literally that which pertains to the polis, which is the Greek word often translated as city-state. But in its broader sense, polis means the whole communal enterprise of human life, society, the community itself as a collective of individuals that is greater than the sum of its parts. So even if I'm saying fuck the police, I'm not necessarily saying fuck the police. In fact, I may be saying the former precisely because I truly care about the well-being of the latter. But, in turn, if I do truly care about the police, then I also care about the people who comprise the police, since they're a part of it. And so I might, if I'm trying to have an actual conversation, not want to say fuck anyone or anything at all. Then again, sometimes maybe I will. It's situational, not absolute. With all this in mind, it may be that this ideal form of political relating happens best in relatively small spaces where you can actually know the person you're disagreeing with. If the center of discourse ethics is found to be not rules but personal care, then it comes down to really knowing people, not just recognizing their handles or badges or flags and associating them with certain kinds of content or authority or power. And there's also something inherently ecological about this principle of localness. When we think globally and act locally, as the saying goes, local doesn't only mean the person who lives in your physical neighborhood. It can also apply to intentional community spaces and interactions that you cultivate online. I realize that what I'm saying may sound in some ways naively idealist and in other ways unfashionably centrist. Why should I bother cultivating curiosity and care when the world is afire with destruction and greed and there's no time for anything but radical action? Good question. How have liberation and change ever come about without being willing to be radically confrontational? There is no absolute answer to that. Even radical action is situational and contextually contingent. Radicalism is increasingly valorized in our culture because being radically for or against something is very clear. And what's very clear is easy to package. And what's easy to package is easy to sell. But I would venture that what's truly radical is a kind of moderation. Not moderation in the sense of patient complacency and not facing down the evils that demand changing, but moderation in the sense of being able to moderate oneself, to examine oneself in order to participate in discourse with genuine care for others. The sharing of space is what creates space itself. This is not only the case ethically, it's the case metaphysically. Time-space is not an empty field. It's not a blank slate where objects reside, but a matrix of spatiotemporal conditions that proceed from the interrelations of actual entities as they unfold. We are the world because we make the world. We are the world. We are matter because of the way we do our mattering. Matter freely. Take back the power. Our feelings of oversensitivity, our tendencies to reactionism are not absolute. They are contingent on the conditions of discourse that we cultivate, both in physical space and in digital space. We can't single-handedly control the conditions of every space, physical or virtual, but we do alter and transform every space we're a part of. Equip yourself with the will to be a critical, kind person whose whole sense of belonging and community is not rooted in imposed identities and unexamined assumptions and algorithmic rewards, but in the radical act of being present with one another, no matter where you are and no matter with whom.